human history appears to be making a transition. I'm referring to a transition from the several decades of relative peace and tranquility that we have been experiencing here, at least in the United States, but other parts of the world. And then there appears to be a transition into a period which seems to be characterized more by oppression of the masses, by tyrants, and I would even say by violence. And if you look at human history, violence, tyrants, and oppression appear to be endemic features of human history. There are always periods of peace, yes, but those periods of peace inevitably lead to dark periods of human history where people suffer at the hands of oppressive monarchs, kings, and tyrants. And here's my question. Is violence, is oppression a necessary feature of human history? Or rather, is it something that happens but is avoidable? Can human history, can human beings rise above this idea that there will be oppression, that there will be wars? Can we, as a human civilization, ever look back at the past, at the violence, at the oppression of the masses and say, well, that's in the past. We've now gone to a new stage in human history. And the answer to that question, I believe, can be derived from this week's Perashat, Perashat Vayelekh. Perashat Vayelekh starts rather undramatically. It is a continuation of the description of what happened on the last day of the life of Moses in this earthly realm. We say the last day of his life in this earthly realm because he immediately went straight to Olam Haba, into the highest level in Olam Haba. So Perashat Vayelekh continues that story, and it says, Vayelekh Moshe, and Moses went. He was standing in the Machane Shekhinah, he was standing by the Mishkan, by the Aron HaKodesh. He was standing there to bring the Jewish people within the Berit, to finalize the Berit, and now he leaves. And where does he leave to? Vayelekh Moshe. The Chachamim explained to us that Moses personally visited each one of the Shevatim. And he visited each one of the Shevatim so that he could bid them farewell and deliver the following two messages. Message number one, I have completed my mission. I took the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. I took them to Har Sinai. I took them up to the Jordan River. But I will not be crossing the Jordan River. I will not be entering the land of Israel. That part of Jewish history will be continued by Yehoshua ben Nun. The second message that Moshe Rabbeinu delivers to the Jewish people is, do not feel bad for me. My life has been full. I am now today, on this very day, remember, it was the 7th of Adar. This is the day that Moshe Rabbeinu is going to be leaving us. He says, on this very day, I turned 120 years old. Because as you know, Moshe Rabbeinu left us on the same date that he came to us. He was born on the day that he died, the 7th of Adar. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, I had a complete 120 years of life. I couldn't ask for anything more. It's time for me to go. So that's the message of Moshe Rabbeinu. But here's the thing. When Moshe Rabbeinu is delivering this message, the Torah itself is not complete. There's still more pesukim that have to be added to the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu writes every pasuk in the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu writes every letter in the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu writes those pesukim which describe his eventual death. Moshe Rabbeinu writes that as well. But it's not just the pesukim that have not been completed. Because at this point in time, Moses only gave the Jewish people 612 mitzvot. The last mitzvah is given in this week's Perashat. And it is, Ve'ata kitvu lachem et hashira hazot ve'lamedaha et bnei Yisrael simaha befihem. That mitzvah is the mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah. And Moshe Rabbeinu proceeds to write and to complete 13 Sifrei Torah. He gives one Sefer Torah to each one of the tribes. And then the 13th Sefer, he gives to Shevet Levi, and Shevet Levi places the Sefer, pursuant to the instructions of Moshe Rabbeinu, in the Aron HaKodesh, in the Ark of the Tabernacle. It is in the Aron HaKodesh. Shevet Levi is entrusted with that last Sefer. And that last Sefer serves a very important role in Jewish history, a subject for another class. The mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah obligates every single man. Every man is obligated to write a Sefer Torah. And it doesn't matter if a person received the Sefer Torah from his father, from his grandfather. It doesn't matter how many Sefer Torah you received. You are obligated to write your own Sefer Torah. That's the mitzvah. And when I was discussing the Perashat HaShavua Friday night, after Kiddush, during the Shabbat meal, as is my custom, my children asked me, why do we need to do that? If a person already received Sifrei Torah, if he has several Sifrei Torah that he received, why does he need to write a Sefer Torah? He already has Sifrei Torah in his house. Or perhaps he gave a Sefer Torah to the Bet Knesset. Why does he need to write another Sefer Torah? And I think the answer is very profound. The last mitzvah in the Torah, as noted, was the obligation on every man to write a Sefer Torah. The first mitzvah in the Torah is Peru Urvu. The mitzvah of Peru Urvu is a mitzvah obligating us to have children. To have children, to continue growing physically. Peru Urvu umil'u et ha'aretz. In his book, The Strange Death of Europe, Douglas Murray describes how European civilization is slowly dying. And one of the reasons for this strange death, and it's strange in the sense that there's no reason for it, but one of the reasons that Douglas Murray identifies in his book is declining birth rates. With declining birth rates, you have a death spiral where civilization begins to collapse upon itself. So the first mitzvah of the Torah is Peru Burbu. What does that mean? It means You should not live alone. Man should not be alone. Man should create a civilization. Man's obligation is to, using the language of the pasuk, is Peru, Wurvu, Umil'u et ha'ares b'chivshuha. The obligation is not to live on a desert island like Robinson Crusoe. No, the obligation is to build human civilization, to take over the land, to settle the land, and to sustain this human civilization, you need to have children. That is an obligation incumbent upon us. And if we don't follow that obligation, chas v'shalom, bar minan, it would be the collapse of society. One of the beautiful things about the modern state of Israel is that the modern state of Israel has one of the highest birth rates in the world. And it is that high birth rate, that strong birth rate that you have in the modern state of Israel, that is one of the fundamental reasons that the state of Israel had such a strong economy, has a growing economy, is a growing society, and is a society with a very bright future, Be'ezrat Hashem Yitbarach, of course. Let's look at the last mitzvah in the Torah. The last mitzvah in the Torah is analogous to the first mitzvah in the Torah. The first mitzvah in the Torah is create many people. The last mitzvah in the Torah is create many sifrei Torah. Create a lot of sifrei Torah. And the question is why? And the answer is human civilization will collapse if you don't have human beings' growth, a growing society. Human civilization will collapse if you don't have an absolute law, if you don't have Torah. Allow me to explain what I mean by that. And this is based upon my father's teachings, alav shalom, Areni kaparat mishkavo, what I'm about to say now. There are laws in the world. France has a set of civil laws. The UK has a common law system. America has the Congress. The state of Israel has the Knesset. These legislative bodies, they issue forth laws. What's wrong with those laws? Why do we need Torah? Why do we need God's law? Why not have man's law? The answer is very profound. The laws legislated by man, the governing bodies legislate laws. These laws are not always for the benefit of the governed. Oftentimes, these laws are there to benefit the governors. Oftentimes, these laws are there not with the thought, well, what can we do to help our society? What can we do to help our people and lift them up? Often the laws are there. What can we do to help ourselves? What can the governors of the state of Israel, us, the Knesset, do to help the Knesset? What can us, the Congress, do to help the political class, the political elite, and those who brought the political elite into power? That's why laws always change. Laws don't represent truth. Truth is absolute. Truth doesn't change. Laws change because they don't represent truth. Laws change because they represent the interests, unfortunately, of those writing the laws. I'll give you an example. The US Constitution. The US Constitution is the highest law of the land of the United States of America, by definition. And yet, the US Constitution is almost irrelevant. There is no freedom of speech in the US anymore, right? That many freedoms have been taken away that are constitutionally guaranteed, but the ruling class has decided to take them away. And there's nothing that an individual can do about that. Consider the state of Israel. The laws are always changing. How come? Because the laws reflect the particular interests of the parties of which the coalition is composed, right? So if you have a party in the coalition that is, for example, anti-Shabbat, they will make laws promoting Hilul Shabbat, for example. If you have a coalition that is perhaps religious, or has a pretense of being religious, so they will make laws which require certain funding to their institutions. So the laws are always changing. And the reason the laws are always changing is because they don't represent absolute truth. Now, here's the thing. People understand when they are being oppressed. When the poor people in France during the period of the French monarchy lived in poverty, and the monarchs, they lived in incredible sumptuous wealth, the people understood that. And came the French Revolution, right? The revolutionary movements in the world, this violence that takes place in the world, and I certainly don't condone it at all. I in no way condone it. I don't even condone the French Revolution, because what the revolutionaries did was simply reprehensible and beneath any simple standard of morality, the way they acted. But that's French history, and that's not the purpose of this class. But the reason there is violence in the world, it is promoted by the political establishment that legislates laws that are not in the interest of the people. And people understand this, and they won't tolerate it forever. They'll tolerate it, but not forever. And boom, then you have eruptions of violence. What's the solution to that? Let me go back to the question I asked originally. Is violence this endemic feature characterizing, in a patchy way, human history? Is it a necessary feature? And the answer is no. There is a solution. The solution is Torah min hashamayim, an absolute law, not a law that is created by legislators, by the political elite, a law that is above the legislators and above the political elites. This law is called the Torah. And the reason this law is above all, above even monarchs, tyrants, and presidents, this law is above all because it comes from God. And this law represents absolute, immutable truths. And when this law becomes the law of the land, people understand that they're not being manipulated. People understand that they're not being oppressed. People would have allegiance to the laws of the Torah precisely because they are not invented by men for the benefit of those men who invented it, but because it comes from the Almighty. And that's the reason that we have the last mitzvah. Every man is obligated to write a Sefer Torah, because the Sefer Torah contains black letters on white parchment. Nothing can be more crystal clear than the laws written on the Sefer Torah, on the scroll of the Sefer Torah. Nothing can be more absolute, nothing can be more clear. But Every man must write a Sefer Torah. We must propagate Sifrei Torah. We must increase Sifrei Torah because every individual must have access to a Sefer Torah. Because if a tyrant ever comes and tells a Jew, you must do this, you must work on Shabbat. I have a Sefer Torah. I know what the Sefer Torah says. I don't need to go to the Bet HaMikdash. I don't need to go to the Kohanim. I don't even need to go to the Bet HaKnesset. I have my own Sefer Torah. I can open it anytime, and I can stand up to the worst tyrant and say, here's the word of God. And what is the word of a tyrant next to the word of God? It is dust in the wind. And the Navi Yeshaya, he says that in the future, that there's going to come a time where God judges the nations. Many, many nations will be rebuked by God because of the oppression of the masses by the leaders of these nations. It could be the EU, it could be Germany, it could be Italy, it could be the United States. And here's the key phrase. It says, it says that there will come a time where all these weapons of war will be turned into weapons for gardening tools, for producing produce in the land. And finally, and then there will be no need for war anymore. People won't go to war. Because once you have an absolute law from God, people feel I'm being treated fairly. God, the Creator, gave us these laws to benefit us. God gave us these laws to help us, to teach us how to succeed, right? So you see that the answer to the question is no. Violence does not need to be an endemic feature of human civilization. Write Sifrei Torah. Increase the number of Sifrei Torah. Because with the increase of the number of Sifrei Torah and the study of the Torah, we hold the Torah dear and we say, this is the law. And when humanity recognizes that this is the law, wars will be no more. And we will live in a state, in a new state of humanity where we will look back at the wars and understand that is a thing of the past, because now we will be in the state of letaken olam, the malchut shaddai.